Dr. Miller, what I think is a very interesting study, and they all are, of course, Journal Club number 10. This is a Journal Club that has a training study using the velocity-based training. So, I think a really interesting study using the back squat and trained men, strength-trained men. And so, roughly a 1.32 strength-to-mass ratio. So, not untrained, a training study using velocity-based training, this could be very interesting. And so the study is called Effects of 4 Different Velocity-Based Training Programming Models on Strength Gains and Physical Performance. So if you're not familiar with velocity-based training, the idea is that instead of just using the percentage of 1 RM and just, I'm doing 3 sets of 5 at whatever, 80%, you say, I'm going to put 80% on the bar, and I'm not going to be limited, though, by, I'm going to terminate the set based on the velocity of the movement of the barbell. So when there's a certain cutoff that's reached, obviously it requires some sort of external feedback, but when a cutoff is reached, we terminate the set. In this case, it's 20%, which is supported by research literature. Okay, that may change in different circumstances, different strength levels, but that was what the cutoff that was used in this particular study was a 20% drop in barbell velocity terminated the set. And so the percentages that were used were the same, except for in the constant load group. So the constant load group did 8 weeks. It was an 8-week study at 67.5%. So they would do the back squat training with this percentage of 1 RM every single time that they use the velocity-based training method. The other groups arranged the percentages that moved around the 67%. So 50%, 55, 60, 65, 67.5, which was common to the constant group, 70, 75, 80, and 85. And so you had a linear group that went from over the 8 weeks from 50, 55 the next week, and so on and so forth. You had a group that was a reverse periodized group, so started heavy and worked their way down. So 85% and then 80 next week and so on and so forth. And then the undulating group, which just kind of implies there's an undulation, and the percentage is a really nice figure if you get a chance to get a hold of the study. It's published in Journal of Strength Conditioning Research. Of course, I'll put the link to the article like I always do at the bottom. But they use this undulating program as well. So you have these 4 different strategies, and the idea was which one is more effective. And what kind of reminded me of this is Louis' pendulum wave, which was a slow linear increase. And granted, there's some confounding things going on when we think about that. It was, accountability and resistance, those type of things. But this was, more velocity-based training. But still, the idea is, what's when we're thinking about more speed type of work, is a constant load at 67.5%. Is that a better way to train than with some sort of organized, periodized training model? And so the outcome of the study supported the idea that the constant load. Okay, and I'm going to use an interpretation of the data, both meaningful and statistical significant. So statistically significant difference, there wasn't one between the groups. But and I'm going to use this but very carefully, okay. Obviously then we would say all four of these strategies were effective. But if you look at the outcomes, and if we wanted to look at meaningfulness and what seems to provide the best, I mean, we're splitting hairs here and saying, well, what's best here in terms of improvement? It appeared that the undulating group was the poorest performing, and I'm just looking at the trend here. So again, we have to recognize that I'm not saying the statistical significance, okay, but just looking at this nice figure that's in here and trying to just simply picking the best. The constant load and the reverse periodization had the highest. Now, again, with that's not statistically significant. There's a lot of variance in the outcome. That's why we didn't get statistical significance. But certainly it appears the undulating approach was the least effective. Not statistically, but if you just look at the figure and look at the scale, the y-intercept, or the y-axis, you can see that there is a difference there. So if you were using a velocity-based training program, this is the kind of the crux of this, you could probably use the linear percentage over time, building over time, which is what I commonly use. The reverse, so starting heavy and working way down, which may be more applicable. I mean, they looked at counter movement jump as well. I think about, if you're training a field court sport athlete that doesn't need to lift heavy loads during their competition, it might be better to have higher velocities towards the end. But it appears, at least in terms of percentage, how fast the bar was moving, that it may be no better to do the lighter stuff last, but it may be effective as well. So as compared to the linear group and in the constant group. Okay, so if you flat load, assuming 67.5 is where you want it, and that 55 to 60s kind of thrown around the research literature is optimal zone for power. So 67.5 is a little bit higher than that, but let's say that 67.5 is where you want it, or whatever the constant load is, probably in that range. You could constant load over 8 weeks, or you could have a linear increase or a linear decrease in intensity over time, and roughly get the same output, where undulating may not be the best way to do things. Again, that's not statistical significant. That's just me eyeballing the numbers and interpreting it, how it might look in programming. If I'm going to pick one, then I'm going to pick the one that of this group that is the most effective. Now, keep in mind, 1.32, back squat relative strength ratio is not tremendous. We're not talking about like 2.0 or 2.5. That could change things if somebody's that strong, into that, I would say, really strong group. That these numbers could be completely different. So, I just thought it was interesting to look at, this was a training study, and, you don't typically see a training study with any sort of strength trained individuals, especially using something that's, kind of the newer idea of training setup, which is using velocity-based training. So, really cool study. If you get a chance to take a look at it, also, the study does break down by, the meters per second based off of one, either under or below. Again, it looks at counter round movement jump, and again, there's no statistical significance between any of these groups and the setups, but 20 sprint time, all these things were no different between the groups. So, appear ought to be effective, but if I was going to pick one, I'd probably pick the linear, constant, or reverse, which is, ideal mostly with weightlifters. And with weightlifters, it might be better to finish at a higher percentage than, maybe working with a soccer player, where you might do a reverse periodize. Now, again, the results of the study say it doesn't matter, but if you're doing other things overlaid on the top of it, like other type of resistance training, sprint training, that may make sense. I'm inferring things here that's not in this study. And so, if we stick with the results of the study and we go straight off of the statistical analyses, it doesn't really matter what you do. I would avoid the undulating based on this study alone. And other studies we've seen that undulating, even though I do use it at times for differing reasons than trying to get strength and power outputs, more honestly for engagement in a program, it appears that just some of the basic linear models are likely more effective, especially when we have a ramp up towards a peak event. I'm not talking about necessarily during a season when undulating may be more beneficial, because you have to work around training schedules and so forth. If you have a sport or events that are coming up or whatever it is, but if it's a one peak event type of sport, like weightlifting, track, whatever it may be, and then you have, a lull before another peak, or maybe a few, you have multiple peaks, but there's, for the most part, the peaks are spread out a little bit and you don't have a 54 game schedule or something. Probably a linear model, the old school linear model might be a better way to do things. So, that's just based on the research literature I've seen. Overall, kind of studying this idea of undulating versus linear. In this case, even a constant loading when doing velocity-based training may be just as effective as the linear program as well. Okay. If you haven't already, subscribe to my channel and be sure to check out other videos talking about, looking at the other journals, journal club, the other topics, which include a variety of topics, also a book club as well, and some topical discussions. Again, subscribe if you haven't already. Like this video, and I'll see you in the next one.